Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on a Sunday evening. I hope everybody is staying home and keeping well. So, today we are super proud to be able to do the first panel discussion in the first session of Humanizing STEM. Before we jump in, I thought that I will just share a little bit about why we are doing this. So, Humanizing STEM is our effort to understand public policy and understand both individual action interpretation and action interpretation on an organizational or even a government level by having STEM based solutions, discussing STEM based solutions parallelly with the humanities, specifically keeping empathy, ethics, and morality in the center of this discussion, especially when we're speaking about conflict resolution or simply trying to evaluate what's going on around us in a more in a way where we can discuss STEM subjects in parallel or tandem, the science in tandem with ethics and morality. So essentially, it's just understanding society a little better and understanding both individual and society level conflict resolution a little better. I think we will have a very good discussion. We have our panelists and our moderator here as well. I'll hand over the session to our moderator, Kartikeya, who is a past Young India Fellow and he's worked in public health. He's also a science student himself. Kartikeya, would you please introduce yourself once again if you feel like, and I think it would be great if you can introduce the panelists as well.
Right. Thank you, Abhinaya. Hello, everyone. As Abhinaya rightly said, I have been, on the border of STEM and social sciences for a while. I am currently a researcher in development economics. So again, this entire topic is very, very close to my interest and my heart. I hope everyone is well and indoors. I will be the moderator for today's panel discussion, which is on humanizing research, unpacking the moral and ethical research. Thanks to Shivangi, Abhinaya, and Amrita for organizing the Humanizing STEM series. As Abhinaya already conveyed, this discussion is one among a series of discussions aiming to explore the relationship between the natural and applied sciences with the social sciences, while also reflecting on the weight that the latter carries in a seemingly and increasingly quantified world. There are many themes that can be culled out from this discourse, but one of the most important discussions that is required within this discourse happens to be morality and ethics and how exactly they fit in research. Here, we aim to discuss not just the role of a researcher, but ethical considerations that any research would require, be it from any discipline. It begs several questions. How much do lived experiences matter in research? How do we ensure that a proof or a certain truth is valid enough? How do we represent the truth? How do research methods shape narratives and or should shape narratives? Several of these questions will be asked within this 1 hour or 1 hour 20 minutes of discussion, which will be divided into about 40 to 50 minutes of discussion among the panelists on the broad schemes before we open the floor to questions which we have received in the registration forms, and we're also taking questions from the YouTube live. Um, if the time allows us. I want to welcome our panelists who are distinguished researchers in their respective fields, ranging from social sciences to economics to biological sciences, while also not being limited to these fields at the same time. We have with us Professor Aditi Saraf. Professor Saraf is an assistant professor of sociology and anthropology at Ashoka University. She completed her PhD from the Johns Hopkins University, and before joining Ashoka University, she was a postdoctoral fellow in anthropology at Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich. She works on questions of political economy, frontiers in mobility, militarization, and material exchange. Her research has primarily focused on the relationship between commerce and sovereignty in the Kashmir region. We also have with us Professor Bittu Rajaraman. Professor Bittu received a PhD from Harvard University in neuroscience. He was then a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Ecological Sciences at the Indian Institute of Science. Prior to joining Ashoka University, Professor Bittu was a part of the faculty at Central University of Hyderabad. Professor Bittu has been a tireless advocate for the Dalit and LGBTQ rights and has written in depth about the issues that the communities face. We also have with us Professor Asmita Kabra, who is a professor in the School of Human Ecology at Ambedkar University, Delhi. She received her PhD in economics from JNU. Before joining Ambedkar University, Professor Kabra taught undergraduate economics in the University of Delhi for 15 years. Dr. Kabra has worked on a number of research projects, studies, and consultancies related to conservation induced displacement in various protected areas in India. Dr. Kabra combines research with a range of hands on development projects at the grassroots level. She is one of the founder trustees of Samrakshan Trust, an NGO working for socially just conservation in various states of India. Thank you so much for joining, first of all, Aditi, Bittu, and Asmita. I want to begin the conversation from its very foundation by asking all of you what, according to you, is ethics and morality? How does it fit in research and your work in particular? And what are the current trends in research which have affirmed this need to have the discussion we're having today? I'll start with Aditi. Aditi, since social sciences supposedly weigh in ethics and morality more than other disciplines, how do you traverse this territory within your discipline? How do you fit in morality and ethics in your work?
Okay. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. And I'll be speaking about ethics and morality, well, to begin with, quite broadly from the vantage of the work I do and what my own disciplinary background is. So I'm a sociologist or a social anthropologist. And as many of you may be aware, the main method that we use to generate knowledge is fieldwork, which basically, which is also called participant observation, and which basically entails deep hanging out over the long term in a social milieu with the people that we ask questions about and want to learn from. So basically, at the very outset, our ethical stance in some ways, or our disciplinary stance, is an ethical stance of studying difference through shared experiences, of engaging the lives of others in a shared world, or just to ask, like, what are the different ways of making sense of a shared world. Now, this is just a summary, and obviously this is not a straightforward process. Like every other discipline, this requires training in protocols of research, in the presentation of evidence, and in kind of constructing a sound relationship between the empirical data that you present and the argument that you make, right? In that sense, the social sciences and the hard sciences, quote unquote, have this relationship of how do you present evidence and how do you then make an argument out of it. We just have different protocols. However, just to keep that point in the background right now, the question of ethics and morals is actually quite central to our work. In fact, some might say that anthropologists are kind of obsessed with the question of ethics, and I think there are three main reasons for that, and I'm just going to go through them very broadly. The first is because of our disciplinary history, the history of our discipline. Our development as a discipline happened as an accessory to colonialism, right? So to know people, you know, those who want to know people to rule them better. And one of the questions that we constantly deal with is how to keep these legacies in mind as we practice sociology or anthropology in the present, right? Second, of course, the ethical component is integral to our methodological practice because we work with other human beings. We interact with them. So we constantly ask, what does it mean to relate to our interlocutors ethically, especially in contexts of immense violence, on marginalization and injustice, but also in contexts where we are interacting with people whose political views might be very repugnant to us, right? But we still have to maintain some kind of ethical relationship to them. So in context of, for example, great violence and marginalization, we have to keep in mind that, you know, we can leave that context, come in and out when we want, but our interlocutors can't. How do we write about the complexity of their experience? How do you protect those who tell you certain forms of dangerous knowledge or knowledge that can be dangerous to them? How do you protect them from unintentional injury? How do you anticipate what might happen when this knowledge gets out? how do you maintain an awareness and responsibility? And this is very important today, especially if you want to engage publicly. How do you maintain the awareness that your readers are not just going to be the colleagues in your discipline, but also the people that you write about? So as a researcher, you may encounter ethical dilemmas with consequences that are not just in your control, and that arise from the complexity of human lives and human interactions. And thirdly, of course, ethics and morality are topics that we study. As a researcher, sorry, is there an echo? Okay. Can anyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So ethics and morality are topics that we study, and we generally make a distinction between morals and ethics. Now, what is this distinction? Very broadly conceived, we consider morals to be these obligatory normative social codes that individuals in a society should follow. So, questions of thou shalt or thou shalt not. And these become necessary, or they're seen as necessary for the stability of societies and for social reproduction. So like if you don't follow these quote unquote rules, social breakdown, quote unquote, can happen. Ethics, on the other hand, is something a little more contingent. And when we talk about ethics, many of us talk about how individuals, but even collectively, how people both individually and collectively engage morals amidst the uncertainty and the flux of everyday life. So when you're faced with dilemmas and the diversity of what it means to live with others, to share your world with others, how do you then act in a way that is good but might not necessarily be moral, right? Because sometimes all the conditions for being moral aren't there. Sometimes there's social breakdown around you. Sometimes there's, you're acting in the context or against the background of great violence and betrayal and so on and so forth. So how do individuals improvise in these contexts is one of the central questions that we look at. So just to give you an example, one of the very mundane, to give you a very mundane example, and then to give you like a more like kind of dramatic example. So one mundane example could be the kind of question that I took to my field work, which was how do traders commit to a movement, the struggle for self-determination, where in order to show their commitment, they're often asked to shut down their shops for long periods of time, right? So how do they both like kind of take this loss of livelihood as well as kind of commit to the struggle of self-determination? How do they experience this dilemma, if there is one? Or of course, in more, in more recent kind of political circumstances, you can think about the dilemma of what might, for example, in the aftermath of a communal pogrom, what would it mean for families to come back and inhabit, say, for example, their burnt house, and be neighbors with the people that they saw in the crowd that burned down their house, right? Like, what does it mean to start anew and inhabit this place of destruction again? So these are basically questions that we take that kind of hope to account for what Shivangi mentioned in very nicely as how do you account for the weight of lived reality. Right. And those are the kind of, and how people do that, go about embracing these dilemmas amid several others in their everyday life is what animates a lot of anthropological, sociological questions. So I'll just stop there for now, and then we can come back to...
Right. Thank you, Aditi. I want to take the same question forward to Bittu. Professor Bittu, how do you fit in morality and ethics in STEM disciplines? Do you think there are barriers? Do you think there are fundamental differences in ethical considerations in STEM as compared to social sciences?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the framework of ethics has been differently conceived in these fields. The standard ethical protocol that sort of applies within the discipline framework of science is one of, so if one is working with animals, is one being relatively ethical when it comes to the treatment of animals, right? This is largely the framework. So when one teaches research ethics in a standard scientific framework, one is thinking about animal ethics, about things like application ethics, and the ways in which ethical incentives do or do not arise in the course of scientific research. So essentially, are there incentives people to be fraudulent or to fabricate research or to make shortcuts and not report them? Are there incentives for publishers of research to be unethical? So, for example, with all of these questions, which are especially relevant in the time of COVID, of science being, and especially publications, getting readers pay for their, to subscribe to scientific data and essentially then hiding information behind paywalls. The alternative models have emerged of journals that ask the writer to pay, that is the author of a scientific manuscript. And then there's a lot of discussion about how it provides an incentive for those publications to allow the writers a lot more leeway in terms of lax reviewing protocol, various things that enable the person who's actually paying, that is the writer, to cut corners. A lot has revolved around these two models. And of course, several scientists are trying to move towards a platform where, since reviewing itself and writing itself and all of much of the actual work into publication is done by scientists for free, the idea is that really everything should be put up free websites, and now the archive and bioarchive and so on are examples of ways in which this move is being done. But yes, these are sort of the very limited sort of views of ethics that are typically taught, considered in the course of scientific research. Now, of course, science has also had raging ethical debates, which have not, found themselves central to the practice of actually teaching or doing science. They've not made it to the center of scientific discourse, but science and several disciplines, including science, have also sort of evolved globally in the context of colonialism, and so a lot of science has also been done that holds ideas that are racist, that are sexist, that are ableist, and so on. Many of those ideas continue till today. And it's quite interesting because very often what social scientists might think of as ideas that just sort of exist independently of science, one finds that there's also been a history of science legitimizing these ideas. And there's an invisible sort of relationship often where science is somehow seen as the justification for various norms that kind of float out there. And one sees, several people can often quite erroneously say, well, I am scientifically correct, I am rational, I am objective, and so on. Mm-hmm. And while we've plausibly really sort of moved so much in science beyond that, beyond the understanding that there is a sort of scientifically definable rationalism, beyond the idea that, so for example, the notion of ableism continues to rely on scientifically taught textbook ideas of being normal, abnormal, disordered, ordered, and so on. And we know so more now about how these categories are problematic, but that push has still not happened for so much that we know in science now to displace earlier notions. For example, we now know that race is not a category with any neat biological correlate. I mean, it's genomically certainly not a category. And many of the superficial correlates of race are things that are completely demolished by the very large number of actually, I mean, there is really no objective way by which to define boundaries and racial categories. So the categorical validity of race, which continues to be used as a medical construct, and for that matter, gender, right? These have simply not been, a lot of the churning that's happening now in the science has simply not translated to those categories being questioned. So I think that, of course, ethics are important to discuss in every field. And I think there are ethical debates in the sciences, and I think many ethical debates also need to translate themselves greater public visibility so that they start to also affect, some of these categories which were really cobbled together by science also need to be demolished by that field, at least in terms of public perception. So I do think science has a role to also play, especially in terms of correcting the ways in which science has contributed to problematic ethical constructs. And I think that, so science, I think, does have that role to play. At the same time, I don't think our ethics should be set by a scientific compass, right? I think that I think that evidence plays a good, an interesting and useful in telling us how one wants to arrive at an ethical world. But it is not the deciding factor for what that ethical world would be. I think we need to make those decisions in ways that do not kind of rest on science.
Right. Thank you, Bittu. Especially the topics of objectivity and colonialism. We'll come back to that. But I want to take this forward. What Aditi and Bittu just said seems like a good segue for Asmita. I want to take this question to Asmita. Asmita, as you said that you were trained in economics, but your role as an economics, in your opinion, in your own words, has lapsed, and you now have moved on to a more humanized research in human ecology and conservation, so to say. I want to understand your worldview as you shifted from one discipline to another discipline.
Okay. I think I'll stay with just talking about what I currently do rather than the transition itself, because I think that provides a nice frame for me to think about morals and ethics in research. And I'll begin by saying that actually all research, in my view, is essentially a moral and ethical enterprise. And the only choice that the researcher actually has is of either making the embedded moral or ethical question explicit or leave it unstated. If you leave it unstated, which is quite common, I see in STEM kind of fields, often the researcher herself may not be aware that there is an ethical question involved, but nevertheless is moving forward with the ethics in the backdrop, and they animate that person. So let me give you an example. So I've now worked for 2 decades on biodiversity conservation and local livelihoods in a national park called Kuno in the Chambal region of Madhya Pradesh. And 20 years ago, 5,000 people were asked, around 5,000 people were, from 24 villages were asked to leave their homes in the forest to make way for a project for conserving the Asiatic lion. So when I started doing my research there, the question that I asked and was seeking to answer is, what is the impact of this relocation from the forest on the people's income and their livelihood security? Now, when I think back about why did I choose this topic, it's clear to me that there was an embedded moral or ethical question which I was not making explicit, which was, should we make efforts to save an endangered non-human species, in this case, the Asiatic lion, even if the saving of it involves a very high social, cultural, economic cost to our fellow human beings. And the moment we confront this trade-off between the welfare of humans and non-humans, further research questions can arise. And they did, and I sort of engaged with them. But the research questions that I'm listing, which arose from as follow-ups, did not destabilize the embedded ethical and moral question of, can we save some at the cost of others? So, for example, we were asking questions about how can rehabilitation be made more effective, more participatory, how can better compensation laws and policies be designed, what kind of institutions can be put in place to make resettlement more humane and less traumatic. But what I want to highlight is that there were a couple of embedded, unquestioned assumptions which emerged from ethics and from morality, which lay behind these researches. The first was, of course, the assumption that saving lions is a priority. Now, so far, so good. I mean, who could question the need to save a charismatic, endangered animal like the lion from extinction? But the second assumption was that to save lions, a people-free site or forest has to be either found or created, because people cannot coexist with lions. Now, this is where the story started to get complicated, because the public policy intervention was planning to bring lions from Gir National Park in Gujarat, where lions have historically and continue to live in close proximity to Maldhari herders and other villagers. So the question that I'm sort of posing is the policy decision to create a people-free landscape for Asiatic lions, was that taken on the basis of the science of conservation, or was it based on our imagination, and our meaning those who make decisions, on our imagination of the forest as a pristine, people-free space, or was it for some other reasons altogether? So the question that I later started asking, the questions that I started later asking, were from a very different moral or ethical space altogether. And these different sort of reformulated, so the shifting of the frame asked for a shifting of methods also, which I'll talk about later. And it created the space for amalgamating the science of biodiversity conservation with theoretical insights from the social sciences and sometimes from the humanities. So, for instance, now the questions I'm asking are, who gets to decide which strategies of conservation and which spaces are best. Is it better to do people-free parks and sanctuaries, or is it better to create mixed-use landscapes? Who damages the forest more? Is it the local person who goes in for food, fuel, fodder, or is it people like us who use cars, computers, have extremely resource depleting lifestyles, but at the same time we drive the question of conservation because we would like to enjoy these pristine spaces of nature, go tiger watching, bird watching, lion spotting, etc. And so by framing the questions of our research through this lens, I find that we are able to make much more explicit the imbalance between some people and other people, people who research and people who we conduct our research on. And in doing so, I think what I have started doing is to move away from what I call apolitical conservation or unpolitical conservation to the idea of the political ecology of conservation, not just the science, not just the social science, but the political ecology. And at one level, this then becomes a question of what can be called biopolitics. Which human and non-human bodies and lives are worthy of conservation, and which can be allowed to just die through benign neglect. And I truly believe that the future of conservation lies in asking the questions with this explication of the moral and ethical basis, which will require us to not just humanize STEM, but also to politicize it, to explicitly politicize it, because the implicit politics is already there. I think I'll stop for now.
Right. Thank you, Asmita, especially for talking about the role of the research and the politics of research. I want to take forward the politics of research into a much debated topic, and that the topic is of the valid truth. Uh, what I mean, what do different kind of methodologies pose? How do they pose a different meaning in research? And can sticking to certain methodologies and numbers mislead us? I want to emphasize on this topic by just giving an example. So, for example, if 2% of Americans are racist or sexist or homophobic, does that mean the issue isn't as big as of an issue? And we can translate this issue into an Indian context as well. So, for example, uh, a recent survey said that most Indians do not agree with the Hindu nationalist country. Should we take that percentage, and should we be okay with that narrative? And how how do numbers mislead us basically? I want to I want everyone to give your opinion on this. I'll start with Aditi.
Okay, so I think there are several components to your question, all interrelated, but I'm going to maybe try addressing it separately and then hopefully bring it together. So this whole, the question of, and in our earlier discussions, you framed it as like a qualitative versus quantitative. Now, of course, there are different modes, there are different modalities of generating knowledge, but that doesn't mean that they're mutually exclusive. And I think the recent kind of experience of the pandemic is really generative of examples that address that kind of question. So I'm part of this fortnightly COVID meeting that we have with other anthropologists, and right now none of us are doing field work because we're all under lockdown, but we're looking at whole lot of models, and the people who make the models constantly say that at best these models are conjectural. There's a way in the data, of course everybody wants data, but there's a way in which data is collected, who's collecting data, what is driving the collection of data, what is the kind of action that data is being used for, are definitely research questions that have both a quantitative as well as a qualitative dimension. So I think what is necessary is to, precisely what the other panelists have also said, is to like have a kind of conversation between different protocols of research and different modes of generating questions and basically managing uncertainty, right, as a collaborative procedure. Now, this whole question of validity of proof, like precisely because different disciplines have different protocols, there are ways of like gathering data and making knowledge out of them. That is, economists, there's a certain thing there's a certain practice through which they do it. Anthropologists do it through a different but related practice. We read each other's work. we use each other's kind of knowledge that, that each other produce. We need to. But basically, I would say that what constitutes valid, and I don't want to use the word proof, and I'll come to that in a second. But what is valid is something that shows a sound relationship between the data and the argument, right? And the different ways of making that argument through the data that you collect. With, of course, the caveat that all this knowledge is provisional, it is not complete, it can be contested when new data is generated, and it can be contested also if you follow different protocols of research. And this is something that people who build models are very aware of as well, right? So this is a conversation that needs to be, as Asmita said, made explicit. But if I were to take an example of from my field of like what would be a valid argument, like say, for example, as data, quote unquote, anthropological data, I find that a trader continues to conduct business in a particular wholesale market when all their colleagues have left, shut shop and run away. So then the questions I would ask is that, why is this trader able to stay? What did they do that others did not do? What does this one case reveal about the relationships in that milieu? How do those relationships that kind of become clear contest official narratives about the conflict? And how do you, what do you learn when you place this particular case study against, say, for example, archival records of trade that show you how traders in the past continue to work amidst political volatility or ecological volatility? So these are the ways that you build an argument. And for example, in the case of anthropology, to build up from a quote unquote case study to make like a broader, to scale up to like a broader contribution that you make to the study of societies. Or for example, even with the question of like what constitutes valid data, like if you take, for example, say a rumor that was floating around in 2016 in Srinagar that, trucks come at night carrying gigantic disease-ridden rats from Gujarat and they release it in our neighborhoods. What would be, then do you ask for valid proof over here? Like, what do you show them, a photograph of the truck, or is there another way to read this data? What do you kind of position this data against, the broader political picture, the broader happenings, to make sense of it? What argument can you make with this little story without showing proof, right? So these are some of the ways in which how you treat data, and the kind of argument that you make from it, and what kind of stakes they reveal become what I would say constitute criteria of validity or valid evidence, right? I'll maybe stop here before I come to the idea of proof and what is it to like kind of demand evidence or demand proof in certain contexts, why in some cases something like proof can be very emancipating and revealing, or evidence can be emancipating and enabling. Other contexts, like asking for proof, is something that is violent and unjust. But maybe I can come to that because I'm sure the others have things.
Yeah, we'll come to the discourse of a valid proof. I'll move on to Bittu, and Bittu, I want you to talk about how does qualitative and quantitative research pose different meanings in your discipline.
Right. So, I think this is a difficult question in the sense that, of course, much of the work that I do is quantitative. I do not do any qualitative work. But I'm also in a psychology sort of department where we have people who do qualitative work. And I will say that I think a lot about whether you want to look for quantitative or qualitative a lot about which method you choose to use depends on where you are in the field, right? So I think if one's starting a new question, very often one has to do initial qualitative work to get a sense of the field, right? I mean, one can only start posing quantitative questions when one knows what to quantify, when one knows how to quantify it, and when one knows what the drawbacks of particular kinds of quantifications are going to be. Right? And ideally, any work that begins proposes a quantitative method, that piece of work is going to have to justify essentially that method on all of these, with respect to all of these, sort of fundamental questions that limit the ways in which that method can then be used. So So I will say that once, if one is satisfied, it's sort of a method of quantification. And of course, one is also constantly innovating new methods for quantification. And I think it's also important for different people who use different measures to really sort of come to an agreement about the limitation of these different methods, rather than sort of people who use different methodologies sort of facing off against or competing with one another with about that they're using, being superior in some way. I think that if, once one is satisfied with that, then a quantification is necessary to go ahead. So, for example, we're living in times of COVID. There are, before one decides that a drug can be administered to a large number of people, one has, for all of these drugs, a series of randomized control trials. There are 3 phases of clinical trials typically are applied to a drug, right? And the first phase is conducted with a very limited population, because really the first thing you're looking for in that first phase is, are there any people who are suffering adverse effects from this, right? And then one has later trials in which one's really doing with much larger sample sizes, comparisons between placebo groups and groups that are getting the medication, to see whether then there's some justification for claiming that the medicine is by itself effective. Now, in general, we support the RCT model. It's the standard model for how medications are, explored. But as was the case when Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo got the recent Nobel Prize in economics for their work with RCTs, there are also issues with RCTs as a method, and so in general, once one defines the question and one knows what one's looking for quantitatively, and RCT is an important thing to do. Without it, one doesn't have a sense. Or one simply doesn't get a sense of the value of, say, of a medication by itself. But RCTs do many things which can often then defeat the original purpose for which the medication was developed. For example, RCTs are randomized, and therefore they're ideally randomized across a population. Right. Besides making RCTs themselves prohibitively expensive, and therefore often something that only biased ethical entities such as drug companies can do, rather than typically being studies of the scale that state finance. I mean, many of these drugs are actually evolved in laboratories of the state, right? Run by the state, funded by the government. But profit making is in the hands of those who can run an RCT, simply because an RCT is so expensive. But expense aside, which compromises the question of then who particularly access the fruits of the scientific work, there is the next question of what happens when you randomize across a population. And I think the effects of these are particularly strong for psychoactive drugs or for medicines that apply to variations in mental health, because I think we really see and experience as a population the fact that a medication which works for one set of people may actually be quite problematic for a set of people. And in an RCT, you're pulling everyone together. You say, a minority of people develop an adverse effect. But in fact, if one is looking at root causes of any symptom, one knows that there are, at least, multiple molecular methods or molecular mechanisms that could lead to the same behavioral outcome. And so if one is addressing the wrong mechanism, and so, that mechanism may be related to one molecular pathway for 50% of people and maybe related to 3 others in the remaining 50%. But if one is using, because there is one medicine that sort of performs best in and out, that pulls it together, if that is then prescribed to everybody, it can actually defeat the entire goal of going through this exercise, which is of finding medicine that's useful, for people who may not have the same molecular pathway for the same behavioral outcome. Right. And so I think the difficulty here then is teasing apart, and the problem really is that diagnostics are prohibitively expensive, and so this is why so far the method has been to just prescribe one medicine, have this sort of medicine fits all model. So I think that's an example of how RCTs are absolutely essential, but if the validity of the claim that the RCT is being applied to is wrong, then no amount of randomizing and controlling is going to make up for that. if the hypothesis is flawed in terms of how it is framed, and one is, say, looking for an answer to a pooled question rather than for subsets of the question, then just the fact that something is an RCT cannot be used to sort of justify shoddy hypothesis framing. And as I said, of course, there are the concerns about RCTs being expensive and therefore biasing the ethical outcome of scientific research. And finally, this question of sort of what happens when you deal with the population of human beings with a variety of genes and a variety of experiences, all of which then certainly experiences change the brain. And if one is not accounting for these things, then you can sort of stick to certain kinds of data collection as much as you want, but you're just not going to get close to addressing the truth of how it is that somebody may have, say, found their way into a set of behaviors that they find difficult to cope with.
Right. I want to, we have about 10 minutes, so I want to move on to Asmita and asking about valid proof before moving on to Aditi. Asmita, what do you think is a valid proof, considering your work in Kuno and the displacement of people?
So I think that this quantitative versus qualitative kind of framing is a classic example of, this world that we're living in. I think it thrives on these artificially created binaries. And I'm not a fan of these. I mean, we look around us and then, you find that so many discourses are framed in these binary terms, very often dichotomies which are false. And one is always being nudged towards taking sides. And what my fundamental problem with this is that, there are very vital spaces of action which are based on dialoguing and assimilation and combinations of approaches, which this, prevents us from doing. So, this is like asking somebody, is a screwdriver better than a paintbrush? Now, hello, what kind of question is that? It depends on the task at hand, doesn't it? So, essentially what I'm arguing is that it is the research question that needs to drive the method. But for some reason, which is unfathomable to me, we seem to have fallen into this trap. And this is particularly true of, my tribe of economists within the social sciences, and then also broadly within STEM, which is that numbers seem to be more objective facts, while qualitative information is just subjective or feelings or journalistic, anecdotal. Yeah. And further, we make this mistake of thinking that qualitative information is somehow less reliable than numerical information. And the scale at which this is done is astounding. So, for instance, national level exercises, which try to capture, development or happiness of an entire nation by a single number, let's say the gross happiness index or the human development index. So, in terms of our lived lives, what does it mean that India's HDI has increased from 0.26 to 0.35? It doesn't mean anything. And it's a numericization fetish that I have a problem with. So going back to my previous example of conservation and livelihoods research, for instance, I find that not limiting yourself to either the screwdriver or the paintbrush works very well. So, for instance, if I had the question in front of me about whether people's incomes have increased or decreased after relocation, I'll probably use a quantitative method. If my ecologist colleagues were looking to find out whether the prey base in the Kuno forest is adequate to support a pride of lions, if and when they come, they will probably use a quantitative method. If I'm trying to look at whether livestock grazing or harvesting of gum is harming floral biodiversity, it's probably a quantitative method that would be deployed. But suppose I had to find out other things that are vital to my moral project, which is that of saving non-human species and landscapes in ways that are not harmful to vulnerable humans. Then my research questions will be many more. They would be, for example, were people asked for their consent before relocation? Did the relocation package reach the poorest Adivasi woman in the village? And if not, why not? I would ask questions about why have lions still not arrived in Kuno 20 years after the villages were moved out, despite a Supreme Court ruling. Why has the Kuno National Park, instead of now being the site for a lion reintroduction, a chosen site for cheetah reintroduction? Why is the State Forest Department, as of day before yesterday, talking about importing African giraffes into the park? And for these kind of questions, it doesn't make sense to create a close-ended questionnaire and then run regressions on it. And I'll have to turn to ethnographic, archival, and other qualitative methods which are informed by theories from the social sciences. And it's only when you combine your tools to frame, valid questions that you can actually contribute to the moral and ethical research agenda that you set out to answer in the first place. And fetishizing either one or the other, and it's equally common on both sides. Oh, you guys are just talking about numbers and my eyes cross over when I look at numbers, or you guys are just talking about feelings, and how do I know that one case study, एक case study hai, what does this tell us about the world? I think that these kind of binaries are harmful to us as researchers, and more than harmful to us as researchers in the world that we live in. It's important to break these narrative fortresses and move towards meaningful engagement between methods with explicit attention to the reason behind that research.
Right. I want to take forward what you mentioned about the SDI and ask Aditi a question. Aditi, when discussing development, how can we ensure that science is not divorced from the human and ethical? And also, could you answer the part about the cruelty of asking for valid proof?
Right. So how do you ensure that development is not like kind of divorced from like addressing human needs? I mean, I just want to go back. There's no hard and fast rule for it, but I just want to kind of go back to what Asmita said, is to have this kind of agenda that first of all, takes seriously the political and ethical dimensions of addressing a problem and making sure that the most vulnerable are not shortchanged in the process. And also combining different methodologies through, and I mean, I said field work, which is in the beginning of my talk that I said our methodological practice is field work, but that's basically ethnography, to do this long-term kind of participant observation of a particular social field to see that what is it that we can see unfolding in the everyday, where people who might come from different, who might be using different and other equally valid protocols of research that make other things visible that are missed, So everybody kind of brings in one aspect, so different kinds of research methodologies, protocols, and questions can reveal different aspects of the problem at hand, which is why it is very important to take all these into consideration when addressing complex problems of human diversity and what it means to live well, and what does it mean to be able to live, I mean, if not a fulfilling life, but at least a kind of a livable life, right? What do ideas of livability and fulfilling mean? Like, what does it mean to take account of both like non-human and human interests? Like, if you, for example, in several kind of political, ecological research context, this whole idea of people versus animals is addressed by asking, like, when the people themselves who live in proximity to those animals say that, when they say that to me it means that, what does it mean for me? Or to frame it differently, how do I lose my world if I lose this animal, or if this animal goes extinct, becomes extinct, becomes one way of thinking together what it might mean to keep the interests of both the human and the non-human in mind, right? So that's a general way of like, and each kind of problem has its own like kind of unique, distinctive, singular dimension. So it's important to study them on those grounds as well. With the question of valid proof, so anthropologists are very fond of, and this is something that many anthropologists have spoken about, of using philosophical examples of pain to talk about when asking for valid proof seems unjust. So suppose you come and tell me that, help me, I'm in pain. And my response to that is like, how do I know that you're in pain? And you say, can't you see that I'm in pain? And I'm like, you could be pretending I can't feel the pain that you're feeling in your body, right? It's impossible. It's an impossible experience for me to have. To like prove to me that you're in pain is actually is an impossible question to answer, right? So this is an extreme example, but what it basically illustrates is that there are contexts where asking for proof is deeply violent and and unethical, and instead one must forge other ways of acknowledging and responding to the pain and suffering of others, however it is that you constitute them. So this is one kind of political and ethical kind of contribution that anthropologists are very kind of insistent about making, particularly those who study kind of marginalized communities or contexts of violence and political repression, so on and so forth. On the other hand, as Bittu has mentioned several times, you can also be presented with evidence that kind of cuts at the heart of racist and racialized ideologies. And since Bittu kind of mentioned race, so Franz Boas, this was 100 years ago, but if when studying, for example, the IQ of immigrant children, Franz Boas realized that while their parents sometimes had lower IQs than other communities, resident communities in America, their children, their IQs were same as their peers. So what this helped him do was to kind of contest ideas, racialized ideas of different communities having different intelligence capacities, right? And also enabled him to argue that that diversities in intelligence are more likely to be found within communities than between communities, right? So these kinds of evidence can be emancipating and enabling. And this also remains like a constant spur to practice, to anthropological research and practice. But I think to very quickly, just to conclude, I think one of the problems that we're facing today is not a problem of evidence. For many problems, the evidence is there for us to see, right? Whether it's of violence or it's openly, flagrantly practiced, recorded, disseminated amongst people. For several actions that need to be taken, you don't actually need more data in order to take those actions. We know what we need to do, but still it's not done, right? So some of the problems or some of the complexity of the problems we face, I think, is not because we don't have evidence. The evidence is there for all to see, but because of other reasons, we refuse to take action in order to correct or move away from what it is that looks wrong or repugnant or unjust to us.
All right, we will move on to questions, but before that, I want to ask if anyone of you have any comments on the discussion so far.
I'll add a little bit, maybe. I know that we're sort of low on time, so I'll be quite short. But I will say this. I mean, the word truth is something that scientifically one takes, one uses this word sparsely, right? And one uses this word only when one really thinks that multiple methods which account for the fact that none of us are objective, right? That each of us carry our own subjectivity into research. That multiple methods sort of start to point to, the weight of evidence starts to pile up and really point towards a conclusion. Itself is enough. The word proof often in science refers to one of two things: either a very strong sort of internal consistency between the outcomes of a process of following a train of logic and into it, or really the idea that one has done a manipulative experiment and that manipulative experiment clearly, reliably, when done by multiple people and ideally confirmed by multiple methods, shows a causal kind of chain of events that are responsible for or that are the cause behind some phenomenon in the world. But the word proof is often used in society, as is the word rational and objective and so on. These words are thrown around socially very, very loosely. And so, so for example, as a trans person, I have lots of examples of this because this question of, is being a queer and natural phenomenon has turned out to be an important phenomenon or an important question that has made its way to legal interpretations of, for example, Section 377, which deemed unnatural sex to be right. And so, but things like that, the question of whether whether this is a natural phenomenon or not, actually does not often rely on quantitative data at all, right? It relies entirely on qualitative data because there are just so many hundreds of species that engage in what's called same-sex kind of sexual behavior that it's this is not necessarily quantified behavior, right? This is just something that as for example, the lab next to mine works with a group of seed beetles, and these seed beetles are constantly mounting one another across, males mount males, females mount females. I mean, it's just there are some scientific phenomena are so evident that that sort of constitutes proof, even in the absence of quantitative kind of being fleshed out quantitatively. Now, of course, there is a lot more to be said about these words, objective and rational, in that these words are often thrown around, by scientists and non-scientists alike, as some kind of claim to superiority of argument, right? And that, I think, is quite bizarre because we don't have really, as people who study the brain, any sense of what it means for one brain to be more objective than another brain, right? One doesn't have a sense of what it means for one brain to be more rational than another brain. What one can do is one can take social science concepts of what it means to be rational and test whether these assumptions about the way people behave are actually upheld by behavior. So, for example, one of the things that we research in the lab is economic notions of rationality, and whether, in fact, that is how organisms behave, and what it is that produces. But even in sort of formulating these, it's quite obvious to us that what is defined as rational behavior, for example, context independence, is just not something that's upheld for a very large number of behaviors. And in fact, in an animal setting, if you were to think of context-independent behaviors, these tend to be simplistic, hardwired behaviors which do not kind of attain the same. These are in some sense one finds simpler for neural systems to achieve than context-dependent irrational behaviors, right? So I think a lot of the value judgments that are loaded into these notions of objectivity and rationality come from this history of essentially rich white men doing science, which has not changed a lot, especially in the field of psychology. It continues to be largely rich, largely white, largely American men doing science, doing psychology. And so even in something which we know to be as varied as human behavior, one finds that those taking a scientific claim to the observation of behavior tend to be an limited fraction of the world, but it's the weight of this kind of the authority really that they carry with them that sort of legitimizes this field. And so I think that these are all things that certainly as scientists we should be tearing down all sources of authority and saying that that people should really be able to question authority and look at the evidence for themselves, whether they're using qualitative or quantitative methods. This notion that really one person is and rational while another person is not, just simply doesn't hold up. It just doesn't account for the fact that people have a variety of motivations, and rationality is a question of how, given a goal, you get there. And yet there is, when people dismiss each other as irrational, they are rarely going after the same goal. Right? And so these are, I could go on forever about this question, but I think it is worth sort of realizing, and I also want to sort of quickly address this question of IQ, right? Which I think Asmita had also spoken about, which is that to this day, IQ tests are considered scientifically valid assessments of intelligence, right? And to this day, there is, I think they continue to carry no validity when it comes to sort of justifications of why some on some particular tests carry more weight than other traits on other kinds of tests. To do something as broad as intelligence. And these end up being, this study that shows lowered IQs for immigrants but a raise for immigrants' children is entirely because of the fact that linguistically, immigrants typically speak other languages from the language in which the IQ test is. And then their children sort of naturalize and speak the same language as everyone around them, and therefore one sees this reversal. So one sees several phenomena such as IQ scores rising over time, I mean, it's not as if we have any sort of notion that within a generation, human beings are suddenly becoming terribly more intelligent, right? And yet, the relevance, the recirculation, and the familiarity with the IQ test is growing. And so a lot is just about whether these are just means for constructing hierarchies of superiority and inferiority, wielded along axes of power. Because, you know, it sounds bad to say, you know, rich people deserve to be, it sounds like when you say these people who happen to be rich are smart and therefore they deserve to hoard a bunch of resources, right? And very often one finds things like this playing the role of that legitimizing force a deeply unequal society. So we really have to ask these questions about whether these notions of IQ, personality, all these sort of behavioral constructs in psychology that have been set up to kind of that really play the role of enforcing these inequalities and perhaps play only that role. I mean, we see this, for example, when we assess animal intelligence. We don't share languages with animals. And so in my work, where we try to assess cognitive abilities in animals, we're just limited by the fact that we don't share a language. And so one sees that across groups of people as well. Now, remember that a totally objective scientist 100 years ago would say, objectively, this IQ test shows that men are smarter than women, right? And nothing has changed over the last 100 years except for socialization. And now an objective scientist would have to say that's not true. So what is objective also changes with socialization. And that's something that it's very important for scientists to realize, as well as all of the ways in which the current system influences what we think of as the norms within which we assess aspects of behavior and you know, the way in which we assess other biological systems as well.
Right. Thank you so much, Bittu. I think you tied together and addressed a lot of topics that I had brought to the discussion and we hadn't really properly addressed. I'm conscious of time, so I will move on to questions we have received from the audience. I'll ask, so this question is from Debrati. They asked, what should be the research methodology if the subject of the study is a marginalized group and the researcher is essentially an outsider? How to ensure it's not an appropriation of their struggle? Whoever wants to go first can go first.
Wow, that's a tough one. Yeah, no, there's no way that you can. I don't think that you know, you can actually sort of point at, you know, reject ABC methods, pick up M, and that method will make it. You know, that method will ensure that you are not appropriating. I think the only way that you can even come close to just the fact that you've asked this question, Debrati, is already good. And a researcher needs to just continuously sort of remind herself of her own positionality and try to sort of sift the material coming in against that. But having said that, sorry, 20 years of working with one community, and you know, I find that actually there's probably no substitute for time. There are things that people told me earlier, which you know, you said, but you know, I wrote it in 2003 because you had responded like this. Like, "Hey, Gigi, tab to tum, you know, hum tumhe jante nahi the," or you know. So the thing is that there's a lot when you're researching with humans. There is so much going on in any case that there's no one method that can sort of resolve this. And when you're researching between unequal humans from, you know, unequal spaces, social spaces, the only thing you can do is to try and address this upfront and you know, and continuously sort of evolve by asking this. But there is no magic bullet in this. And as a very, very dear friend once said, and I always say to students, magic bullets can also kill. You don't want one either.
Right. I want to add a similar question to the already present question and move on to Aditi and Bittu's response. One second. Anasuya asked, isn't it a moral imperative to help out if there are issues that can be addressed by the researcher's means and contacts and so on? But then if you do address it, does it make you a biased researcher? I think this question really applies to researchers, journalists, everyone, really. So, Aditi or Bittu, if you could.
I just want to say, I mean, if I may go first, I just want to say that this is that a question of bias like this one is precisely what is created by these dichotomies between objective and subjective. Is that it doesn't have, you don't have to be a biased researcher if you do what is in your power without compromising your other interlocutors, whatever you can do to help somebody who's in need, right? Whatever your resources allow. Depending on like what kind of help they need. So no, I don't think that would make for a biased research. But also in continuation of kind of what Asmita said, like this is something that anthropologists always grapple with in some ways, especially those working in precisely those in unequal social contexts between the researcher and her interlocutors, is that, where does research, how to keep research ethical and avoid like making it, and how to like kind of avoid slipping into the parasitical realm, right? And this is something that we like kind of think about a lot. Some others say too much, but I mean, again, a very dear friend, just like the magic bullet kind of metaphor, another anthropologist friend, like think of the anthropologist as a honeybee going to extract honey from a flower. You get something out of that, but you don't leave the flower any poorer for it. It's like slightly modeling. But it does kind of give a framework about like to think about where is it that, I mean, okay, so you obviously you're enriching your knowledge, hopefully it'll be something, but you can't control that it'll, be an enrichment for everybody else. But how to make sure that you don't do any damage in the process is a question that you have to address through protocols over and over again. And some of those protocols are spelled out in the sense of like anonymize, remove identifying markers, so on and so forth. Others are the kind of ethical dilemmas that you kind of deal with every day in the context of writing up research, and it has to be addressed on a case-by-case basis.
Right. Bittu, what do you think?
Well, I think that it depends on the question that one's asking. So I think that, so as I said, I think it's important for scientists to not claim objectivity. Very often, of course, we're working with non-human systems where one doesn't have a very strong kind of bias one way or another. But very often scientists still show biases towards their ideas of how they think the world works. And so even though it's a somewhat different context, those kinds of things can absolutely bias the ways in which scientists interpret their data. Right? Very often they're steeped in the framework that they have been researching. And most labs continue to not publish questions that they have asked whose answer turns out to be no. And this is also part of the problem with how publication ethics work, and how publications do not encourage these negative results, as they are called. It's such a loaded name in and of itself. That's part of it. But the other part is it depends on what your question is. So I, for example, am also an activist. And so I've so far kept my activist work and my inquiry, my views completely separate. Because if one's question, for example, is how has some event, adverse event influenced, say, the socioeconomic structure of an area, if one is in that same area influencing the socioeconomic status of people, then that could be something that changes one's results. So I think that for all people in research, it's a difficult situation in terms of of ensuring that what one's reporting in terms of results from the field are not influenced by one's own actions. So I think that is something that all researchers do have to keep in mind. But I think that the generalized concern that academics are taught to have about any form of involvement, even the forms of involvement that are not related to the questions they're asking at all, somehow compromising their objectivity, I think that's really, again, another one of these means by which academics are encouraged to stay in the ivory tower and not really get involved in the ethical sort of issues that are raised or that they see raised in the course of doing that.
Right.
May I add to this
of course.
on the issue of publication ethics that Bittu is talking about? see, one sees very often this anxiety among researchers, who are going into spaces which are unequal and trying to find out something. And your respondent is mostly not in a position to turn around and tell you to just buzz off, you're wasting my time. And in addition to which, in researches of this kind, the researcher is kind of loading all of her own anxiety onto that community. You hear this very often, that I've interviewed 25 people, and more or less everybody is giving the same answer, and is this sample size enough now that I can come back and publish? I mean, so the anxiety is coming from somewhere entirely different. It is coming from our life and our own compulsions, but it ends up having an impact. So it's not just about appropriation. So yes, this is not an answer, but a further sort of complication of the researcher and the respondent dynamics, that mostly they're not in a position to say no, and they are not in a position to resist your anxiety either.
Right.
And so all the more reason to be super cautious, and just if only the publishing world and was a little more open to the idea of allowing people space to research. And also, why do we research after all? I mean, if you're researching for the purpose of getting a degree, or having yet another paper, this becomes an added oppression,
Right.
Onto the subject that we are researching.
Right. I'll move on to the next question. This one is asked by Arushri. She asked, does the Indian context call for flexibility or rigidity in upholding research ethics? And should research ethics and morals be the same across all contexts? And she uses context interchangeably with countries and regions.
Mhm.
Whoever wants to go first.
Same answer. At one level, it's the same question, in the sense that you're looking for magic bullets. You're looking for, tell me what is the right answer so that I can score on this. No, it has to be context specific, and it's not just the country, but it's the context is also inside of the researcher. It's both.
Yeah, and it's this, as mentioned, is the social position of the researcher in relation to the community as well. So for example, I mean, and also and not just the social, but it could be a gendered question, like, certain spaces can only be inhabited by, for example, it would be difficult for a male researcher to do research on, women's private lives, or how they kind of spend time, when their men folk are out because of it. So these things all have to be taken into account. And what also has to be taken into account is the positionality of the researcher in relation to the context that you're studying. And it can kind of manifest itself in something as crudely as like, oh, what if it's a white researcher versus a brown researcher going into, say, a village community? Their experience of the kind of data, or their kind of method, or what kind of data they are privy to and what they are not, might be different, and the researchers have to be aware of that. Doesn't mean that one's is greater than the other. So for example, if I work in the marketplace, there are certain things I can't do. I can't share tea and cigarettes with the shopkeepers when they take a break, right? I have to adopt a completely different role in what is otherwise a very male space, and be very careful about what my deportment, dress, and modes of address are. But that doesn't mean that I'm necessarily I might not be able to be privy to the conversations that they're having over tea and cigarettes, but I notice other things that are happening. So one also has to kind of change their vantage depending on one's situation. So that's also another extra thing to keep in mind, in addition to all the other kind of conditions that prevent you from having a single answer to the kind of question that you're asking.
But I still want to say that to that, Aditi, that I think there's researcher anxiety seems to be a phenomenon.
It is,
and to which one has to say that every research is an exercise in constraint optimization. I've just reverted back to my economist jargon.
Absolutely.
And no research will ever be complete.
Yeah.
So all you have to do is to demonstrate that given the circumstances, you did the best you could and were
Absolutely.
mindful. And that
Hmm.
should be enough. Nobody is asking you to go out there and get all the right answers and, using the right methodology. Because
Right.
ultimately it's not about that. And
Right.
this is an anxiety that I think, maybe there's something wrong we are doing as faculty, that it creates this kind of anxiety. But it really shouldn't be there.
Or the burden of proof, again, like this certain kind of dogma
Exactly.
of what is evidence, what is proof,
How
that
do I
needs to
know
be
you've done this?
exactly, that needs to be destabilized in order to kind of undo some of these anxieties as well.
Especially in social science research with human
Especially,
subjects who
yeah,
are in positions of powerlessness vis-a-vis you. It
powerless or
cannot
even
be.
power. Yeah, exactly.
Also that.
Also power. Yeah.
Right. I'm very conscious of time, so I will ask for any closing remarks before we end the session.
None from me, thank you. I think I've said everything that I'd wanted to cover.
Right.
Same
Aditi,
here.
Asmita? Okay.
Same.
No, I just want to
Except thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And just to very quickly add that numbers also, like for social scientists, again, to like kind of undo that dichotomy, numbers also have many dimensions. They can be magical, they can be descriptive, they can be ways of acting upon social worlds. So again, just to kind of insist on kind of undoing that dichotomy between, I can't see number, it's very important to have those conversations and to be able to look at all of them. So it's high time that you undo the whole qualitative, quantitative direction, close like kind of your aspect, and refuse to look at certain aspects of things because they fall out of your kind of the dogmatic protocol. So that's all.
Right. I'd just like to say thank you to everyone, Aditi, Bittu, and Asmita, for such an insightful conversation. And it was very nice to know about your research as well as how you fit in ethics and morality in your discipline. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. You can stay tuned for more panels on humanizing STEM. Hopefully, we will take forward this conversation in another panel soon. And our YouTube live will be up on the same link. Thank you, everyone, and see you.